We are called to be able to defend our faith in the marketplace of ideas. And today that means understanding the scientific claims that seem to conflict with the Bible. And paramount in that area is the teaching of evolution. So this evening we're going to be dealing with the subject of evolution, which in my opinion is the single biggest impediment, other than sin, that can keep someone from coming to the faith or lead to a loss of faith. Evolution is. We got to remember that that today we are in the midst of a debate over worldviews. We are being taught two different worldviews. We're taught one worldview on Sunday morning, and we're taught a completely different worldview the rest of the week. The public school system has become dominated today by an atheistic worldview. Now, in particular with regard to science, today the scientific community has become mainly atheist, and not all scientists are atheists. I wouldn't say that, but studies have shown that most of your scientists, practicing scientists today, are atheists, and the science that's being taught in public schools is certainly a science based on atheism. Specifically, it is science has got themselves involved in teaching history. They're not just trying to learn about chemistry and physics and understand how astronomical processes take place. They're not just trying to figure out how stuff works. They're teaching history in our science courses, which is why our science museums now are called natural history museums. They're changing what they're attempting to do, what scientists are attempting to do today from within this atheistic worldview is explain how everything came about through purely natural processes. This is the reigning philosophical view that's being adopted by scientists today, what we call naturalism. They believe that everything came about through purely natural processes, and they would argue you must explain any physical phenomena as occurring through purely natural processes. This is the view that the scientific community has adopted and the view that they teach. Only naturalism is permitted to be taught in our public schools today. And within this atheistic, naturalistic worldview, evolution has come upon the scene as an attempt to explain how life came to be here through purely natural process. We have to understand that that's what evolution is. It's an attempt by these scientists who have adopted an atheistic worldview and are trying to explain the world as coming about rigidly through naturalism. They're trying to explain how life came about without God through purely natural processes, and that's what evolution is. And in my opinion, this theory can be very convincing, in particular to young people. And I believe that these persistent teachings of evolution, in particular to young people, can lead to a loss of faith to young people who have grown up in a Christian home, and it certainly is an impediment that keeps them from coming to the faith. They need questions answered. How can we believe the Bible, what the Bible says, if it conflicts with what the history that scientists are teaching today? This is the problem. Scientists are teaching a history, and that history conflicts with the history that's written in the Bible. Jesus himself said, "I've spoken to you of earthly things and you do not believe. How then will you believe I speak of heavenly things?" This is an important verse for us. If we cannot believe what the Bible says on historical matters, like the global flood or creation itself, how can we believe what it says on spiritual matters like salvation? This is the issue at stake here. We need to be prepared to address the teachings that are coming from scientists today which conflict with the biblical history. Because if a person believes the historical content of the Bible is untrue, how can they trust the spiritual content of the Bible? If we can't believe what it says about creation and the global flood and these kind of historical events, how can we trust what it says about spiritual matters like salvation? This is the problem. And so we need today to have ongoing educational programs like this in our churches to help people understand how those same scientific findings can be interpreted differently. Because remember, what science is teaching today are not facts. They're not teaching facts. They're teaching an interpretation of scientific findings. They're teaching an interpretation of what they've observed, but that interpretation is coming from an atheistic, naturalistic worldview. If we want to reconcile the conflicts that exist today between what scientists are teaching and what the Bible is teaching, what we must do is look to the observations, look to their findings, and then interpret those findings ourselves consistent with the biblical worldview. The thing we should not do, the thing that a lot of Christians have mistakenly done, is to assume what science is teaching is correct. And then they look to the Bible to see how they can reinterpret the Bible to force it to be in agreement with what scientists are teaching today. This is the problem. We have a lot of Christians today that believe in evolution, that believe what scientists are teaching today, and now they're coming up with twisted interpretations to get the Bible to be in agreement with what scientists are teaching. Instead, we should be reinterpret the findings to bring it consistent with the Bible, not reinterpret the Bible to be consistent with their interpretation of findings. Do you understand the difference? It's an important difference. Well, let's talk evolution. Now, this is how Prentice Hall biology describes evolution, and I want you to read through this. Prentice Hall biology, just so you know, is one of the most widely used biology textbooks used in public schools today. And every biology textbook teaches evolution as a foundational theme for the course, but they will also have focus chapters that deal directly with evolution, and this is one of them. Prentice Hall biology, they say, Darwin argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years. Evidence for this process could be found in the fossil record, the geographical distribution of living species, homologous structures, living organisms, and similarities in early development or embryology. They teach this as matter-of-fact terminology. There's no, we think it happened this way, this is what we believed happened. It's matter-of-fact terminology that's used here. So we want to look at this, understand that there's evidence from living populations, evidence from the fossil record, and we want to look at a little bit at both of these. We'll look at, and we'll start with diversity. We'll describe Darwin's theory and then start with the first evidence to support evolution, diversity, and then we'll go through these in order. So let's talk about Darwin's views. Now, Darwin again, did not invent evolution. Darwin didn't invent evolution. There were a lot of evolution of Darwin's day, but he brought something a little different to the table. His view on evolution included two main parts. Descent with modification, that newer organisms are modified versions of their ancestors. He believed that evolution occurred through what he called descent with modification. But also he gave it a mechanism. Organisms change through time because of this mechanism referred to as natural selection or survival of the fittest. It is a mechanism that Darwin drew from his own experiences as a breeder. Now, Darwin himself was an accomplished breeder of pigeons. And and we well know the kinds of techniques that are used by breeders when they create new types of pigeons or new breeds of dogs or new breeds of cats. We know that process that's involved, and it's a process of what we call artificial selection. When we want a bigger breed of dog, we start intentionally breeding only the big dogs. And eventually you will end up with a line of dogs that's much larger than the one you started with through what we call artificial selection. Well, Darwin argued that the same thing occurred in nature through natural selection, that based on their survival, how well they can survive, they would be selected. An organism that has characteristics that enable it to be more able to survive is going to be selected, and the population will tend to shift in that direction. Well, again, he took these observations from his own experience with pigeon breeding. Lots of crazy pigeon breeds have been developed through time from a wild type pigeon called the rock pigeon. And from this rock pigeon, using selective breeding techniques, breeders were able to create all kinds of wild breeds. And it was from this process that Darwin took his theories on natural selection. These domestic breeding histories we term artificial selection have provided us a good model of what is likely happening in populations in nature. Nature, Darwin argued, also selects who is able to mate and pass on their traits because some traits are more beneficial than others, giving them a greater chance of survival. And so traits such as body size or type of hair have become very important in what we call natural selection, or the way organisms change through time, what we can call evolution. I'm showing you this chart. This is just one of the charts Darwin published to show how the pigeon breeds were developed over time. We know these histories. Well, again, Darwin argued that these same processes were occurring in nature, that these domestic breeding histories were a good model of what's happening in nature. Traits such as body size or type of hair can have a dramatic impact on environmental fitness or predator-prey success, and thus increase the chance of survival and reproduction in a population. Organisms change through time to adapt to their surroundings, and that is what is generally observed to be an evolutionary process. So one of Darwin's other main observations, other than his domestic breeding history in breeding pigeons, was what observations he made while on board the HMS Beagle as an unpaid naturalist. Another synonym for scientists today and of old is that we call them naturalists, because again, they're natural processes alone. They argue for naturalism. Well, Darwin was an unpaid naturalist on board a shipping vessel called the HMS Beagle, which went all the way around South America out to the Galapagos Islands. And on the Galapagos Islands, he made some important observations that helped him connect artificial selection with natural selection. Now, the Galapagos Islands are an island chain that's right there on the equator, just off the coast of South America. Well, on the various Galapagos Islands, what Darwin observed were different breeds of pigeons, different species of pigeons. And on these different species of pigeons had different kinds of beaks. Some had larger beaks and shorter beaks. He theorized that all the finches he observed on the Galapagos Island had descended from a common ancestor which had originated on the mainland of South America. And while this is very likely the case, Darwin proposed that all living things on Earth had descended from a single common ancestral form in this way. The problem is that all the finch, like all observable evidences, examples of evolution, are still finches. The finches didn't change into anything else. Their beaks changed, but they're still finches. And all examples of evolution are this way. When they use bacteria as an example for evolution, they're still bacteria. When Darwin's classic icons of evolution, the finches are still finches. And actually, some researchers went back and studied the finch. Because of the importance of this population in Darwin's views, the researchers went back and studied the finch, and they found that the finch beach does change through time. What would happen? A drought would occur on the islands, and the beaks of the finches would change due to this drought to be able to get to foods that weren't available before. So foods that they have to eat now during this drought that required a different, more formidable or thicker beak. The population's beaks changed during this drought. But what they found is that when the rains returned, the beak changed back to the median type. It's a reversible process. Yes, organisms can change through time to adapt to their surroundings, but oftentimes the change is reversible. They come back to where they were before. And there's no upward progression. They're still finches. They're still bacteria. There's no example of the kind of evolution that Darwin described. Well, although Darwin's book was called On the Origin of Species, that he published in 1859, he actually never talked about the origin of species, how species originate through time. He just described how organisms would change through this process called natural selection. Never actually got into how species develop. Well, a species is defined today as a naturally occurring breeding group that is reproductively isolated from other such groups. That definition passed down by Ernst Mayr. So a species is an isolated population, a population that's isolated from other populations of the same type. And a population can become isolated. And if a population becomes isolated or splinters off from a mainland population, you can describe that point in time as being the time when a new species developed, if that isolation is considered to be permanent. This is one type of speciation called geographical separation or allopatric speciation. There are other described forms of speciation, sympatric, parapatric, peripatric, but in this form, this geographical separation type of speciation, it is found that related populations can become reproductively incompatible following a significant period of isolation. What happens? Using this diagram, what happens? You can have a parent population like you see over here, this original population, and what happens as the population gets larger, one part of the population might migrate around one side of a lake or mountain range. The other part of the population migrates and starts adapting to life on the other side of this geographical barrier. Again, that can be a lake or mountain range or anything else. Well, once what's been observed is when these two populations that have remained separate for a period of time, when they're reunited, what tends to happen is they remain separate. These populations that have lived for a period of time separate from one another will develop specializations to those different areas. So think about on this side of the Cascades versus the other side of the Cascades. A population on this side of the mountains gets a lot more rain than a population will on the other side of the mountains where it's much more arid. The populations will adapt to those areas. Well, if those populations reunited after a period of time and they interbred, those specializations would be lost. And so what happens is that these specializations are preserved by God designing into these creatures an instinct to remain reproductively separated after a period of isolation like this, to preserve those specializations that develop. And actually those populations can become permanently reproductively separated. If two populations adapt to different areas, their genetics can become different, so significantly different from one another, that when they reunite and attempt to mate, they're genetically incompatible. Their chromosomes essentially become unable to pair and cross over during the first mitotic division after fertilization, leading to permanent reproductive incompatibility. And we can point to some populations, many populations like this. Populations that won't breed out in wild situations, but can be made to breed in captive situations, or that when they breed in captive situations can't produce fertile offspring. So this is the case. And we can point to some natural examples of this. This diagram here is from the Instantina salamanders in California. Interesting, we have seen this exact same kind of speciation happen in these salamanders. Through time, though, again, what happens is when these two populations that colonized or lived on one side of a valley versus the other side of the valley, that the specializations that developed during those periods of separation are important. And when those populations reunite on the other side of that valley, they remain reproductively separated instinctively. This is an instinctive process. And instinctive processes are built in. So instincts are things like migratory routes. A bird will just suddenly migrate a long distance, not something inside of that bird told it it's time to migrate. You need to migrate now, you need to leave now, you need to fly 2,000 miles all the way to this island. Birds know how to do this from birth, unguided. No one shows them the way, no one shows them when to leave. These are the kind of instinctive or innate behaviors that have been built into organisms by God. And one of these is responsible for this process we call speciation. So what can happen following a history of an organism can lead to the production of many different kinds of species, many different species, all very different from one another through time. As these geographical separation events take place, as organisms move around the world, migrate to various regions around the world, they develop separate species, and then in different habitats on the world, they do specialized adaptations in those individual species, and it can lead to a family tree like the one that you see outlined here. This is an evolutionary historical diagram that evolutionists are fond to use, called a phylogenetic tree. And we can accept some part of this. We can accept that from one created type of animal, multiple species that are tremendously adapted to various habitats have developed through time, since the creation or since the flood. However, Darwin used this theory to argue that all organisms on Earth were descended from one common ancestral form. This is what you see produced by evolutionists, not just the phylogenetic tree of a finch population as it changed through time, but they argue this same process was responsible for all organisms on Earth, that all organisms on Earth have descended from one common ancestral cell is what is argued by evolutionists today. This is the problem. We can accept a quantity of evolution, but they're using this process, this design process of speciation and adaptation to propose that all organisms on Earth have descended through this kind of process. They're using what is an observed process of evolution, what we can call microevolution, the process whereby populations adapt to the surroundings and change through time. This process also leads to a change in gene frequency, or what we call allele frequency. They're using this observed process of evolution to argue for this broad theory of evolution, what we could call macroevolution, that all organisms on Earth have descended from a common ancestor, and that life arose spontaneously on Earth in the distant past. They argue for spontaneous generation, an origin of life through natural process at some point in time. Well, Ernst Haeckel, shown here, I want to introduce you to. So Ernst Haeckel was an evangelical promoter of Darwin in Europe. In fact, Charles Darwin himself believed that it was Ernst Haeckel's enthusiastic promotion of his theory in Germany that led to its acceptance there. And understand that by extension to Europe. So this man, Ernst Haeckel, an evangelical promoter of Darwinism in Germany, ultimately led, even according to Darwin's own views, to its acceptance in Germany, and then by extension to Europe itself. Well, even Ian Taylor in his book, In the Minds of Men, describes Ernst Haeckel this way. He says, he became Darwin's chief European apostle, proclaiming the gospel of evolution with evangelic fervor, not only to the university intelligentsia, but to the common man by popular books, and to the working classes by lectures in rented halls. This is how Ian Taylor described Ernst Haeckel. He was an evangelical promoter of Darwinism. And in fact, Ernst Haeckel was the first person to draw an evolutionary tree, a family tree that included mankind. You can see up at the very, very top of that diagram, mankind shown there. First person to include mankind on the evolutionary tree of life like this. However, to fill in the gap between the apes and man, he had to come up with an ape man. And so, Ernst Haeckel believed that the only major difference between man and ape was that man could speak and ape could not. He therefore postulated a missing link, which he called Pithecanthropus allelis, which means speechless ape man. And he even had an artist draw up the imagined creature that you see here, although there was not a scrap of physical evidence to support his existence. A contemporary of Ernst Haeckel's by the name of Professor Rudolf Virchow, who was famous as the founder of cellular pathology and for many years was the president of the Berlin Anthropological Society. Rudolf Virchow was scathing in his criticism of Ernst Haeckel. For Haeckel to have given a zoological name to a creature that had not been proven to exist was to Virchow made a great mockery of science. Scathing in his criticism of Ernst Haeckel. Well, in 1837, Darwin sketched a diagram of an evolutionary tree in his first notebook on the transmutation of species that's dated in 1837. And I show that diagram to you here. This diagram is on display in some museum, which is at the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, if I remember correctly. Now, some of the writing is not legible here, so I'm going to give you the text of it and explain what he's talking about here in this diagram. Now, at the very top, you notice he says, I think, and you'll see an evolutionary tree written there. He says, I think the case must be that one generation then should have as many living as now. To do this and to have as many species in the same generation requires extinction. Thus, between A and B, there's the immense gap between them of relation. Between C and D, there's a finer gradation or gap. Between B and E, there's even a greater distinction. Thus, genera would be formed, bearing relation to ancient types with several distinct forms. Note in this that he mentions extinction twice in his description of this tree of life. The reason for this is to explain why there are groups of animals, while there are gaps between animals. And this kind of illustrates one of the biggest problems with evolution. Now, again, I mentioned before that Darwin did not invent evolution. Many people of Darwin's day believed in evolution, but the reigning view of Darwin's day was called saltation. They believed that evolution occurred in saltatory steps, rapid and big jumps. Because when they looked around at living populations, when they looked around at the organisms they knew of in the fossil record, which were basically the same, they saw these huge gaps. There are huge gaps between every type of organism on Earth. Huge gaps between these. That's one of the distinctive things that you see. These enormous gaps between creatures. You know, even if you just look at the reptiles, right? There's a bunch of lizards, right? But then there's a bunch of turtles. And there's a huge gap between your lizards and your turtles. But if Darwin was correct, that this process of natural selection was a mechanism through which organisms change through time, because we know well how long that process takes. Remember, through artificial selection, through these breeding histories, we know this is a long and lengthy process that's slow and gradual. No big jump has ever been observed by a breeder of animals. But when they looked around, when Darwin and his contemporaries looked around at living populations, they saw these big gaps, these groups separated by huge gaps, when the ones in the fossil record were basically the same. Well, Darwin assumed that he was correct and that these gaps were just due to extinctions. But he actually gives a carefully worded apology in The Origin of Species that he can't point to fossils to support his theory of slow and gradual change through time. He actually gives an apology for that, but predicts that through time, the fossils would eventually be formed. The fossils would eventually be found. This is one of Darwin's biggest problems. And one of the things that we've learned since Darwin published The Origin of Species is that Darwin didn't know that the missing links are really missing. Darwin assumed they were only missing in living populations because of extinctions. He assumed they would be found in the fossil record. But we've been looking for these missing links now for 150 years, and the gaps remain substantial. Understand, for Darwin's theory to be true, what should be found in the fossil record are fossils of an organism as it slowly and gradually changes through time. Maybe from a swimming organism, it will gradually change through time to a terrestrial organism. But we should find those intermediate forms in the fossil record. We don't. For almost every animal or plant we find in the fossil record, when they first appear in the fossil record, they are fully formed, perfectly formed, with all of their specializations, and in many cases they're identical to the living populations that we still have today. Highly specialized forms. When they first appear in the fossil record, fully formed, perfect organisms. And we're talking about highly specialized types. The bats, flying animals like bats, the first time they appear in the fossil record, a perfectly formed bat. No indication what evolved into the bat. And this is the general characteristic of the fossil record. In fact, there's an event described in the fossil record during which life suddenly appears with such significance that it's called an explosion of life. It's called the Cambrian explosion. There's in the fossil record, they find only bacteria, going back billions, literally to them, billions of years, right? Bacteria, all the way going back since literally the very beginning of the earth. And then suddenly, boom, at one point in time, in a geological era they call the Cambrian, life suddenly appears. All of the major invertebrate phyla that we have today, boom, just suddenly appear out of nowhere. Where's the slow and gradual development of organisms like Darwin described? From that one ancestral cell, you should have had slow and gradual accumulations of organisms through time, seeing nothing but colonials for a while, and then eventually to multicellular organisms. Well, this is recognized. The absence of transitionals is recognized by your specialist in the field, but rarely admitted in text. Rarely will they admit this in text. Stephen Jay Gould, who I show you here on this slide, is arguably one of the most famous paleontologists of our day. And I say this because he was actually featured on an episode of The Simpsons. You know, that's a claim to fame for his sciences today, being featured on an animated series, apparently. But Stephen Jay Gould, again, one of the most famous paleontologists of our day, admits to the rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record. He says, here, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only on the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. James Valentine is an evolutionary biologist at California University, and he makes this confession in What Darwin Began. He says the fossil record is of little use in providing providing direct evidence of the pathways of descent of the phyla or of the invertebrate classes. Each phylum with a fossil record had already evolved its characteristic body plan when it first appeared, so far as we can tell from the fossil remains, and no phyla is connected to any other via intermediate fossil types. Indeed, none of the invertebrate classes can be connected with another class by a series of intermediates. This is a huge problem. The organisms that are alive today are the same as the organisms we find in the fossil record. There are huge gaps between them. I mean, you look at the various invertebrate phyla. Those organisms are about as different from one another as an organism can possibly be. You look at the echinoderms, like your starfish and your mollusk, right? And versus your cnidarians. I mean, the vertebrates are as different as they could possibly be. But if Darwin's theory was true, instead of these distinct groups, what we should find is an imperceptible blend from one into the other, both in living populations and in the fossil record. Well, these gaps, these groups of organisms make perfect sense within the biblical history. Because remember, the Bible says that God created many kinds of plants and animals. Many kinds of plants and animals are described in the creation in Genesis 1. Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind, and it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, the cattle after their kind. Animals were created in distinct kinds, plants and animals in distinct kinds. And we know at the time of the global flood, a very important event for understanding the history of our world, we know that those representative kinds were put on board the ark as well. We also know from the description in the text that of the biblical kinds at the time of the flood, one pair of unclean animal was put on board the ark and 7 pair of clean animals. And this is very helpful to us because we know the difference between the clean and unclean animals. The clean animals were those that were obligate herbivores. They chewed the cud, they have the cloven hoof. The unclean animals are your carnivores and your scavengers, such as the dog. So we know at the time of the flood there was only one pair of dogs put on board the ark, one pair of canines. And if your creation biologists are correct about the evolutionary history of these organisms and what makes up the biblical kinds, it is generally viewed that the family, I'm talking taxonomic family of classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, that in mammals, the family level of classification appears to be closely synonymous with the biblical kind for most. So the family Canidae, that has the canines, is a biblical kind. There would have been only one pair from the family Canidae on board the ark, reintroduced afterwards, and all the dogs. Your wolves and your coyotes and your jackals, all of these have descended from that one pair of canines that were put on board the ark through this process of natural selection and speciation. We're creating all these various types of populations. And we know from domestic breeding histories that all of the dog breeds that we have were all ultimately bred out of the gray wolf. The gray wolf was domesticated by humans, and breeding of them started where, once they were free of natural selective pressures, and man-made selective pressures were the only pressures determining who mated and who didn't, man was able to create all these various dog breeds. So this is important for us in helping us understand evolution within the biblical context. The kinds have developed through time into a number of highly specialized species, but that this process was designed. Now, one of the other things that Darwin didn't know about was heredity. Darwin didn't know anything about heredity, how traits are inherited by offspring. Nothing was known about DNA. Darwin didn't know anything about DNA, didn't know anything about heredity. The principles of heredity were actually established by an Austrian monk by the name of Gregor Mendel, who conducted plant breeding experiments while living in a monastery in Austria. In 1866, his work, titled Experiments on Plant Hybridization, was published in the Proceeding of the Nature Research Society of Brünn. But the significance of Mendel's work went largely unrecognized until the turn of the century. Well, what Mendel did, it's kind of important to see the significance of this. What Mendel did is he did breeding experiments with pea plants, where he would breed 2 different pea plants together, like a pea plant that had a purple flower, like you see on this diagram, with a pea plant that had a white flower. He would pollinate the purple plant with the white plant's pollen and create a hybrid. And then he was looking to see what would happen if he did that. But what he found was something interesting. When he did that, when he created these hybrids, in the first generation, they were only one of the plant types or the other. This established one of the principles of genetics, that some traits dominate the other. Okay? But what he also found was when he self-pollinated that hybrid, he replanted, mated that hybrid back to itself and then planted those. What he found was that recessive trait, that white flower, appeared in that next generation again. Most of them were that dominant trait, but that the recessive trait appeared again, but always appeared in a 3-to-1 ratio, a fixed 3-to-1 ratio. And through these experiments, Mendel was able to establish that we have 2 genes for every trait, that these segregated independently into sex cells, and that dominance and recessive was part of the traits that we inherit. He established this. But that diversity in populations had a limit was one of the things he established. He actually repeated this same experiment, breeding together 2 different traits, like a tall pea plant with purple flowers and a short pea plant with white flowers. He mated these 2 types of plants together to see how those traits would pan out in the populations. And likewise with this, he found very fixed ratios of traits within populations, a 9-to-3 to 3-to-1 ratio. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot of variability available to populations today, but the amount of variability is fixed. And the way traits are expressed in populations is in fixed numerical values. There's nothing random about it. The traits, the diversity of traits we see in offspring that are present in populations are produced by design. The formations of species and the preservation of those adaptations is by design. This whole process is by design. Well, I wanted to pause here for a second and make a point. That along with Mendel, many of our most important scientific discoveries throughout the last couple of centuries have been made by Bible-believing scientists. Many of the founding fathers of the various science disciplines were Bible-believing scientists. People like Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, Nikolai Copernicus, Robert Boyle, believed that the God of the Bible created the cosmos and were very committed to the existence of God. Moreover, because they believed the cosmos was designed, they assumed it was intelligible to the human intellect, leading, arguably, to the scientific revolution. It was, in fact, the belief that the cosmos had been given order by a lawgiver, which led to the concept of the scientific law, these fixed constants we find within the universe, rather than the chaos assumed by naturalism. We got to remember that our science that we learn about today, mostly due to observations and conclusions made by Bible-believing men of science. The scientific revolution itself, the very concept of the scientific law, due to Bible-believing scientists. Okay? Well, Darwin, as I mentioned before, Darwin also didn't know anything about DNA. They didn't know anything about DNA. They didn't know what was inherited, whether it was proteins or DNA. That DNA was the material, the molecule that was inherited, that was responsible for traits, was unknown during Darwin's day. Well, let's look at a little bit what DNA is so you can appreciate better the significance of what Darwin didn't know. Well, genetic information exists in a long strand, a molecule that exists in a long strand we call DNA, that is found in the nucleus, the center compartment of our cells. Well, what DNA is it's information. DNA is information. And because of this, DNA itself is arguably the most powerful argument of intelligent design that exists. Because it's information. No one denies that it's information. It's actually in code and instructions that cellular machines use to make proteins, to make other machines, essentially. It's the instruction that a machine uses to make another machine. That's what they are. That's what DNA is. And because it's information, again, it's one of the most powerful arguments for intelligent design that we have. Because in all human experience, In all human experience, information is only known to come from one source, an intelligent mind. So when information was discovered inside of cells, it should have led to the conclusion that that information, that the cell itself was also likely the product of an intelligent mind. Because that's how science is supposed to work. You're supposed to use your prior knowledge to inform your observations and lead to a conclusion. Our prior knowledge says that information comes only from an intelligent mind. When it was observed that information existed and governed the life of cells, it should lead to the conclusion that the cell was also likely the product of an intelligent mind. That's how science is supposed to work. But instead, our worldview, the worldview of scientists today, is influencing their conclusions rather than the information that they know to be true. Okay. Well, let me show you a little more about how genetic information works. The DNA exists in a long strand they call a double helix, which is like a ladder, like this molecule you see here, this animated GIF. It's like a ladder that's twisted, and it's called a double helix. The shape of the molecule is called a double helix. Well, each step or rung along that ladder is made up of one of four possible building molecules that are abbreviated with the letters A, T, C, and G. So when they determine the sequence of molecules along a DNA chain using measurement devices like this thing right this on this chart, this is a DNA sequencing gel. I ran a bunch of DNA sequencing gels when I was a technician at Texas Tech. Did a lot of DNA sequencing there. But when you determine the sequence of the molecules along the DNA chain, it generates data that looks like this. Bunch of A, T, C's, and G's in a very specific order. The order of those molecules in the chain instructs the cell how to make one of these protein machines. Again, well, if every A, T, C, and G in the genetic code is equivalent to a letter in our alphabet, if we want to look at the information equivalence in that way, that if the A, T, C's, and G's on the DNA chain are equivalent to the letters in our alphabet, then the amount of information in one human cell is equivalent to as many letters as there are in 1,000 books. Or to put it another way, a small little pile of DNA, the size of a pinhead, a 2-millimeter pile of DNA has about as much information as there are in 500 stacks of books reaching the moon, or a single stack of books reaching to the sun. A stack of books, ladies and gentlemen, 93 million miles high is the amount of information in a single, in a small little pile of DNA, 2 millimeters in size. That's what you're looking at there. Well, where do the evolutionists say all this genetic information came from? Where does this information come from? Well, the evolutionists say this information came about through random mutations, random changes to DNA. Understand that as a cell divides, as an organism makes a new child of itself, you have to copy all that DNA. Well, as the DNA is copied, sometimes the copying may be done incorrectly and an error was introduced. There are actually mechanisms in cells to check that, to check the copy against the parent, and it corrects those. Has a correcting enzyme called forgot the name of the enzyme. Not DNA ligase. Anyway, there's a repairing enzyme that goes up and down the genetic code and checks it after it makes its copy. But a copying error can come in, or if you're exposed to foreign chemicals, or there's chemicals that are mutagens that if you're exposed to those, can alter the genetic the genetic code, or things like UV bombardment is a known mutagen as well that can modify the genetic code. Well, evolutionists argue that through time, that more genetic information was accumulated through random changes to the genetic code. Well, this proposal by evolutionists is the most ludicrous aspect of the theory of evolution that exists. Most ludicrous. It is the argument that you could take a book, you could take a set of some information and randomly change the letters of that text, that information, and make more information. That I could take a book down off the shelf and start randomly changing letters and make another book, make a new volume. That is what the evolutionists are arguing, that by randomly changing the genetic code, it actually made more genetic code through time. The difference between a lowly bacteria and us, the amount of DNA difference between us and something like a lowly bacteria, that all of that increase in genetic information came about through random mutations. It's an affront to logic. It's an affront to reason, and it's an affront to common sense to propose such a thing. But they have nothing else. They have no known source of genetic information other than random natural causations, which is their mechanism for everything. Chance. Natural processes alone must be responsible for the formation of information. Well, again, an affront to common sense, an affront to all of our observations, because we know what mutations do. They cause disease and disorder. We can point to a vast list at this point of genetic diseases and disorders that are due to mutations. When you start changing the genetic code, it causes problems. The protein that would have been made by that gene, by that instruction, doesn't work. And this leads to a great number of genetic diseases and disorders. However, to be completely fair, I'd have opportunity to look over some mutants, and when I was a technician at Oklahoma State, in the plant transformation facility at Oklahoma State, I had a chance to look over some mutant ice plants that have been made, all the different shapes and types. Very, very incredible. Mutations at times can do some very amazing things. Don't just do harmful things, can do some amazing things, and we know this. For example, just an important example of what mutations are able to do. Some mutants have been able to shoot laser beams out their eyes, or to be able to shapeshift, to change themselves into whatever form they want, or they can have such tremendous healing power that you can coat their skeletons with adamantium or something. Okay. I'm trying to be funny here, because obviously this is the real. It's science fiction. Mutations don't lead to improvements, except in science fiction. That's it. They destroy the organism. That's what happens. It really, like I say, it's an affront to common sense. It is like suggesting that you could take the blueprint of one of my big old analog TVs that I still have in my home, that I could go into that blueprint and change the instructions on that blueprint, and suddenly I got me the blueprint of a nice new flat screen TV. That is what evolutionists are proposing, that random changes to instructions, random changes to the assembly instructions, the DNA, which is an assembly instructions, that changes that instruction actually led to better proteins, more genetic information. It's ridiculous. Well, Darwin didn't also know about molecular machines. Darwin didn't know about molecular machines. Darwin said on The Origin of Species that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find out no such case. Because in Darwin's day, they knew very little of the cell. Very little of the cell. The cell theory itself, that organisms were made entirely of cells, and that cell processes were responsible for all of life's, all of life. That cell theory wasn't formed until around the same time, the early, mid-1800s. Where did they even understand that organisms were made completely of cells? Okay, they knew very little of the cells. So it's understandable that Darwin wouldn't know what we know today, and that cells are tremendously complex, and they are full of these sophisticated molecular machines, like this molecular machine right here. This is a little walking robot, walking a package, a payload, if you will, from one side of the cell to another side of the cell. It's a protein called a kinesin. It's a molecular machine. Cells are full of molecular machines doing all kinds of work. Look at this. These are bacteria. Not only do our cells have molecular machines, bacteria, arguably the simplest organism on earth, has a machine that it used to swim with. These little bacteria are swimming because they have an outboard motor that they use to swim with, an outboard motor called a flagellum. And through this, using this little outboard motor, these things can move incredibly fast. You see how fast these bacteria are moving across the field of view here? Well, they're able to move like this because they have a motor. They have literally an outboard motor. The flagellum is a nanomachine that is built using the information in approximately 50 different genes. And it is composed of 25 to 40 different proteins, depending on the species, each of them in multiple copies, ranging from just a few to some up to 10,000 copies of the protein are needed to make some of these components. The component proteins are synthesized within the cell body. Those that make up the long filament, the long strand of actually forms through a self-assembly process. The incredible machine found within the body of a lowly bacteria. Incredible design that we see here. In the scientific journal Cell, the flagellar expert David Rosier said the flagellum resembles a machine designed like humans. So perhaps that observation should have led to even at least the suggestion of intelligent design. But scientists won't suggest intelligent design because to them, again, naturalism is the reigning view. Everything came about through purely natural processes, and they must come up with theories to explain the origin of things that at this point are still beyond our understanding. Some of these molecular machines are so complex, we're really not sure exactly the specific ins and outs of how they work. But this flagellum is the world's smallest rotary propulsion system. That's what it is. It is a rotary propulsion system. It has all the parts that we would place in a motor that we make. It is constructed of proteins. Again, each of these proteins serves a different function, but some of these proteins make up the rotary motor. Others make up the bushings. Others make up the drive shaft. There's a rotation switch regulator. There's a universal joint. And then the long helical propeller that's found there. All of these are made of different proteins. The instructions to make those different proteins are again made because those instructions are present in the DNA. Well, Francis Crick, show you here, was the co-discoverer of the DNA helix. He was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1962 for discovering the shape of the DNA helix. Listen to what Francis Crick says. He says, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. There's lots of evidence of design, lots of evidence of intelligent design, but to hold to your theory of evolution, you must constantly keep in mind that it's not designed though, but it's evolved. I know our observations and evidence indicate intelligent design, but we cannot for 1 second entertain that possibility because you're talking about creation there, not against an evolutionary process. Darwin also didn't know about the problems regarding life's origin. Now, Darwin believed that life had spontaneously arisen on Earth. That's one of the foundational views of the theory of evolution. In a letter that he wrote to a botanist friend of his by the name of Joseph Hooker in 1871, he said this: "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are present which could ever have been present. But if, and oh what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures formed." Darwin believed in the origin of life, through purely natural process. Many people did during Darwin's day. Believed in what was called spontaneous generation. They saw life just spontaneously emerge from other living from life, especially from like dead and decaying matter. You know, meat that's left out, seemingly undisturbed. Next thing you notice, so there's like maggots growing on it. And to people of old, they just assumed that those had spontaneously generated on that meat. A number of observations point in this direction. Well, in 1668, a guy by the name of Francisco Redi conducted an experiment to disprove this. He actually did an experiment where he put gauze over containers with meat or not, and sure enough, no flies grew on the container that had a gauze over it, preventing the flies from landing on the meat, disproving that. But a lot of people still believed in spontaneous generation, which was actually bolstered. The belief is bolstered after the invention of a microscope. Because what people can see under magnification are lots of little swimming microbes in water, which seem to have come out of nowhere. You can start with a clean glass of water, stick some grass in it, and come back after a couple of weeks, and that thing is swimming with all kinds of ciliates and flagellates, just swimming with all kinds of things. To people that had observed this, it seemed like they were spontaneously generated. But now we know that those things are everywhere. Spores in the water, spores in the air, and they get, Louis Pasteur eventually disproved spontaneous generation outright. He was a devout Catholic, so a Bible-believing Christian who was actually known as the father of microbiology. I'm going to just tell you a little more about who Louis Pasteur was. His discovery that most infectious diseases are caused by germs was one of the most important scientific discoveries in medical history. He actually isolated or identified several strains of bacteria that caused pathogens. He isolated and identified Staphylococcus that causes staph infections, Streptococcus that leads to strep throat, and Pneumococcus that leads to pneumonia. He discovered these. And he also developed vaccines for many diseases such as cholera and anthrax and rabies. Developed vaccines for these, Louis Pasteur. But a Bible-believing Christian. A quote from this slide speaks to that in part. Happy the man who bears within him a divinity, an idea of beauty and obeys it, an idea of art and an idea of science, an idea of country and an idea of the virtues of the gospel. He was a Bible-believing Christian. Well, the French Academy of Science sponsored a contest for the best experiment to either prove or disprove spontaneous generation. And Pasteur won. In his award-winning experiment, what he did was he boiled meat broth in a flask. This is the actual flask that Louis Pasteur used. And on this flask, you'll notice that he bent the neck. So it's called a gooseneck flask. And within this flask, he had meat broth. And after boiling the meat broth, let the flask for a period of time, and as Pasteur assumed would happen, no, it didn't become contaminated. It didn't become as contaminated with bacteria, fungus, or any of this kind of stuff. But what Louis Pasteur then did was he then tipped the flask so that the meat broth was able to run up into the bent part of the flask and then drain back in. And when you did that, boom, almost immediately became cloudy with contamination after a day or two, because the broth had managed to collect some spores from organisms that had settled out of the air. He proved that spontaneous generation did not happen, but that instead life had arisen under these circumstances because it's everywhere. So they're in the spores for these things, are in the air and in the water and on cover surfaces. And well, although spontaneous generation had been conclusively disproven by Louis Pasteur, by the way, this was also in 1859. Louis Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation in the exact same year that Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Well, although he had done so, conclusively disproved spontaneous generation, Ernst Haeckel, who we met previously, continued to advocate for it a full 20 years later. Ernst Haeckel says this: if we do not accept the hypothesis of spontaneous generation, then at this one point in the history of evolution, we must have recourse to the miracle of supernatural creation. You can't have that. So life must spontaneously generate, and evolution includes that. They regard the process as being very, very slow, beginning with the formations of molecules and then eventually a cell, but they still hold to spontaneous generation, although they argue it's a much slower process than their predecessors assumed. Well, in 1883, 24 years after Louis Pasteur's award-winning experiment, Ernst Haeckel committed another act of fraud to prove that life had spontaneously arisen on Earth. He claimed the existence of some first cells that he named monarans. And he described them as not composed of any organs at all, but consisting entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. He said these monarans are nothing more than a shapeless, mobile lump of mucus or slime, consisting of albuminous combination of carbon. Well, where does Ernst Haeckel see these monarans? Where did he see these cells that are simpler than the cells that we know of? Nowhere. They are simply a product of his own imagination. They are, and in fact, a theoretical necessity for the theory of evolution. We must find a cell must have existed that is simpler than the cells that exist today, because very few people that know how complex a cell really is could entertain that thought. that something like that could just spontaneously form all on its own. Well, not having found monerans didn't stop Ernst Haeckel. He ended up making more than 30 drawings of these mythical monerans, which were published along with 73 pages of speculations in a prestigious scientific journal in 1868. He also gave these monerans scientific names. Proto-amoeba primitivia was one of them, because a primitive proto-amoeba must have existed before the complex amoeba we find today, so why not just go ahead and make it up until it's discovered. But the extent of the detail in his drawings of these monerans is really a good measure of the fraud that was committed. And further heightening the deception is illustrated well by the fact that Ernst Haeckel knew well about diatoms. These are diatoms shown here. Diatoms are single-cell algae that are enclosed within a cell wall made of silica, which have these beautiful symmetrical forms. Ernst Haeckel knew well about diatoms. These cells are not shapeless. They are very shapely. Ernst Haeckel published on diatoms. These are two of the plates, graphics, that Ernst Haeckel published in a book in 1904 titled Art Forms in Nature. Isn't that interesting, though? That not only did he know well about diatoms, Ernst Haeckel worked at Jena University in Germany, which at that point in time had access to some of the best microscopic technology available to the day. So there's just no excuse for something like this, for a scientist of the level of Ernst Haeckel, a professor at a university like that, to commit an act of fraud like this. Unconscionable. Did he do it to further the theory of evolution or his own career or both? Some kind of assume both. But he named these mythical creatures monerans, and Monera was a name invented by Ernst Haeckel, was the name given originally to the bacterial kingdom. The various kingdoms of organisms, kingdom Animalia, kingdom Planta, kingdom Protista. The bacteria were given the name Monera originally. That's how I learned them when I was in college. It was the kingdom Monera. But they were since renamed to Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. But it's the monerans that Ernst Haeckel received the name of bacteria. The bacteria received the name monerans from Ernst Haeckel, and these cells that receive the name Monera from Ernst Haeckel we come to find out are in possession of one of the most complex molecular machines we know of, the bacterial flagellum. Cells are not shapeless, they're very shapely, and they're not little lumps of mucus or slime. Cells are vastly complex, unfathomably complex. So complex it's hard to even conceive of that level of complexity, but there they are. Let me add further weight to the problem of the origin of life by showing you some numbers. Probabilistically, what is the probability of a simple protein forming, even one simple little protein forming? Some people have done some calculations on this, and I just want to show you the immensity of the problem of getting a simple protein that's only 115 amino acids long to form. And understand that most proteins, most enzymes, the enzyme machines in bodies are not short little proteins, 150 amino acid length. One very important one called RNA polymerase is 3,000 amino acids in length. Very important. But let me show you the probability of forming just one little protein. Proteins have peptide bonds, but there's only two peptide bonds. There's two different bonds that can compete there. So if only peptide bonds are used, so that would give a probability of 1 in 2 to the 150 power. Only left-handed amino acids are used in proteins. That's another probability we have to calculate in there. We need a correct number of amino acids in our chain of 150 amino acids, but we can reduce that number because some amino acids can be swapped out. To determine our probability, and without going into a lot of detail, we would need to multiply these three numbers together, because only a peptide bond is used to connect amino acids together. Only left-handed amino acids are used, and in any given pool, you would have left and right-handed amino acids, and then we want a correct sequence of amino acids. If we multiply those three numbers together, we get this probability. This is the calculated probability of one protein forming through purely natural processes in a random environment, like you would find in some little pond. to get only left-hand amino acids, to get only peptide bonds, and to get a functional amino acid, get a functional protein, the probability of that is 1 out of 10 to the 164th power. And the simplest cell we know of, that we've been able to find, has 250 functional proteins. And this cell is an obligate parasite. The simplest cell we know of is an obligate parasite living in the human urinary tract, and it can live with only 250 proteins because it uses so many of our resources. It's a parasite. So it can live with only 250 proteins, but if we multiply that 1 out of 10 to the 164th power by the 250 proteins needed by the simplest cell we know of, we get this number. 1 out of 10 to the 41,000th power is a probability you're looking at of just getting the proteins to form. But cells are not made of just proteins. There are multiple macromolecules needed for life. You got to have DNA. You got to have the DNA, your nucleic acids. You got to have your proteins. You got to have your carbohydrates. You got to have your lipids. All of these big macromolecules exist in every cell on Earth. You have to have all of these formed naturally through random processes. And there's a bigger problem with another problem that I mentioned here on this slide, and that's you have to have all of these at the same time. And the protein DNA system requires both, in particular to the exact same time. You have to have DNA to make proteins, and you have to actually have to make proteins to make DNA. Which of these came first? That question is neither. You have to have both at the exact same time. It is a challenge that evolutionists have yet to answer, and they must be called to answer. The cell itself is vastly complex. All attempts to explain a natural origin of life are completely vacuous. Although Darwin and his contemporaries assumed the cell was very simple, today we recognize that the cell is unparalleled in its complexity. There's truly nothing we can point to. It exceeds the complexity of all of everything else in human experience we've seen. Drawing on an analogy of its complexity is difficult. Our marvels of modern technology pale in comparison. The cell contains orders of magnitude more moving parts than any of our marvels of modern technology, like a big 747. Orders of magnitudes more moving parts than a big 747, more moving parts than a big factory that makes Boeing airplanes. The cell is as complex as an entire city. It has countless molecular machines, these enzymes, factories full of machines, in fact, we call these organelles, a central library of information we call a nucleus, a system to distribute that information, an infrastructure called a cytoskeleton, highways that self-assemble, and armies of delivery vehicles carrying manufactured goods where needed. Truly, the cell is unparalleled in its complexity and adaptive design. Well, another main supporting evidence for the theory of evolution that we mentioned previously is homology. In reality, the fossil record and interpretation of the fossil record and homology stand as the two main supporting evidences for the theory of evolution. So let me explain to you what homology is. Homology can be found when we examine the various organisms on Earth. We can see similarities. We see similar structures. You look at the forearms of various mammals, and you can see the same bone developments. They've got the same number of bones. The bones are shaped differently because the limbs are specialized to do different functions, but you see the same bones. These are what we call homologous structures. And we don't just see them at the macro level, morphological level of anatomy like this. We also see them at the cellular level. When you look at the various cells found in the various organisms on Earth, you see the same structures inside the cells, the same organelles inside the cell, the mitochondria and chloroplast, your Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. We see the same organelles in vastly different organisms. And if you look at the molecules in those cells, you also see molecular homology. You have the same proteins and lipids and nucleic acids and that are found in every cell on Earth. The same molecules to an evolutionist, these homologies to an evolutionist prove common ancestry. And they believe that all life on Earth has descended from one original cell because all cells on Earth have the exact same information-bearing molecule, DNA. The same molecules like DNA are found in these cells, so they believe a cell only evolved once. At one point in time, you had a cell form. The origin of life at this point has been pushed all the way back to like 3.9 billion years, according to their dating. But they believe the cell just formed once, and all life on Earth has descended from that common ancestral cell they call the last universal ancestor because of this homology, because of this molecular and homology that you see within cells. Well, the term homology was actually coined by this guy. This is Sir Richard Owen, who defined homology as the same organ in different animals under every variety of form and function. He was a British anatomist and paleontologist who was renowned for both his contributions to the study of homologies, but also to vertebrate anatomy and for his works with fossils. He was actually the first person to recognize dinosaurs as different from modern reptiles and coined the word dinosaur in 1842 to describe this group of reptiles. So very famous for a number of significant contributions to science. However, today, he is referenced infamously because of his strong oppositions to Darwinism. Now again, he coined the word homology, which today, he was a Bible believer. He coined the word homology to describe these structures that he sees, and homology is today used as one of the main proofs of evolution. So Owens himself attributed these observed homologies to what he called archetypes. Now, archetypes, which he defined as biological structures that are similar because they conform more or less to pre-existing patterns, that is, to intelligent design. Owen credited God for the existence of these archetypes. In his book On the Origin of Limbs, he said the knowledge of such a being as man must have existed before man appeared. For the divine mind which planned the archetype also foreknew all of its modifications. We could construct an archetype based on our designs that exist as multiple variations, like automobiles. We could do the same thing that Owen did. If you examine all the various types of automobiles that have ever been made by man, you could find design elements common to all these. That is what these homologies really are. They are common design features that God used to create multiple diverse organisms. They're not proof of common ancestry. They're proof of a designer. That is what these homologies really are. Again, they are design features. However, in 1859, Charles Darwin offered a different explanation for homology. According to Darwin, animals possess homologies like similar bone structures because they inherited them from a common ancestor, not because they were constructed according to the same archetype. In 1982, Charles Darwin offered, the evolutionary biology Ernst. In 1982, the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr defined a homology thusly, according to Darwin's theories. He said, a feature in two or more taxa is homologous when it is derived from the same or corresponding feature in their common ancestor. So interesting, what Darwin proposed as an explanation for homology became its definition. And today, homology, along with the fossil record, stands as the primary physical evidence used to support the theory of evolution that all organisms on Earth are descended from one common ancestor. There are, however, some serious problems with using homology in this way. For example, according to the neo-Darwinism theory, homologous structures are due to heredity. Because genes with similar sequences are unlikely to originate independently through random mutations, you understand, gene similarity is asserted as being due to common ancestry, and these similar genes are called homologous genes. In addition, homologous structures like limbs should develop through the same mechanism if they were inherited from a common ancestor. But it has been shown that homologous structures are frequently not due to the same genetic code, and homologous genes are involved with the development of vastly different structures. Sir Gawain de Vere, that you see here, was one of the foremost embryologists of the 20th century. He was a professor of embryology at University College in London, a fellow of the Royal Society, and went on to become the director of the Natural History Museum in London. In 1971, he wrote a paper which he titled Homology, an Unsolved Problem, in which he states this: The inheritance of homologous structures in a common ancestor cannot be ascribed to the identity of genes. What mechanism can it be that results in the production of homologous structures, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes? How can they be evolutionary derived? I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered. Again, homologous structures, like limbs, should develop through the same mechanism if they were inherited from a common ancestor. However, structures that are claimed to be homologous frequently develop from entirely different embryonic tissues. The appendages, invertebrates, and the alimentary canal or digestive tract are derived from different embryonic tissues. How can they be evolutionary in origin if they come from different tissues? The development of digits, fingers and toes in vertebrates have also varies considerably. Human embryos develop a thickening at the end of the limb. Then programmed cell death called apoptosis divides the limb into 5 regions, which then develop into digits. By contrast, though, frogs, amphibians, the digits grow outwardly and independently from individual buds. They develop completely differently. They can't be homologous, evolutionarily homologous, if that's the case. Sir Gavin de Beer stated in his book titled Embryos and Ancestors that correspondence between homologous structures cannot be pressed back to similarity of positions of the cells in the embryo or of the parts of the egg out of which these structures ultimately are composed, or of the developmental mechanisms by which they are formed. They can't be evolutionary derived then if they develop differently in the embryological development. And some final comments on homology from Jonathan Wells, who has a PhD in molecular and cell biology and is actually a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. He says, homology, whether defined morphologically or phylogenetically, cannot be attributed to similar developmental pathways any more than it can be attributed to similar genes. So far, the naturalistic mechanisms proposed to explain homology do not fit the evidence. And one last example for you here. I mentioned embryology in the beginning. So embryology is also used to support evolution by arguing that organisms who share similarities during embryonic development are more closely related in ancestry. This concept represents Ernst Haeckel's most infamous act of fraud. To promote his hypothesis, he actually falsified these drawings to make it look like the human embryo is initially identical to the other mammals. He also asserted that embryos go through a series of former evolutionary stages during embryologic development, where it first has, for example, gills like a fish and then a tail like a monkey. He called this unsupported hypothesis the biogenetic law. Perhaps not surprisingly, though, this hypothesis is still upheld by many evolutionists today using the mouthful, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means that the development of the organism repeats or recaps its evolutionary history. The continued support for recapitulation amongst evolutionists is most troubling, given that this act of fraud by Ernst Haeckel was brought to light way back in 1874 by one of Ernst Haeckel's contemporaries, by the name of Wilhelm His. Dr. Wilhelm His was a Swiss anatomist who invented the microtome used to make slides. He showed that Ernst Haeckel had added 3.5 millimeters to the head of the dog, had taken 2.2 millimeters away from the head of the human embryo, double the length of the human posterior, substantially altered the details of the human eye, and he sarcastically pointed out that Ernst Haeckel had taught at Jena University, which at the time was the home of the finest optical equipment available and had no excuse for such inaccuracies. He concluded that anyone who engaged in such blatant fraud had forfeited all respect, and that Ernst Haeckel had eliminated itself from the ranks of scientific research workers of any stature. But despite the fact that His had shown the alterations that were made by Ernst Haeckel, his embryos and his theory on recapitulation continued to adorn textbooks for close to 150 years. 150 years. In 1997, the full extent of Haeckel's fraud was brought to light when Michael Richardson, an embryologist at St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, evaluated the embryos of various vertebrates and published the results in the prestigious Journal of Science. The title there reveals the full extent. Haeckel's embryos, fraud rediscovered. In an interview for the London Times, Richardson is quoted as saying, "This is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. What he did was to take a human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and the others look the same at the same stage of development. They don't. They are fakes." Now I want you to understand the importance of this. You may think, well, why do we care that Ernst Haeckel made up this ape-man, Pithecanthropus alulis, and why he made up these monarans like Proto-amoeba primitivia? Why do we care that he made up these species? And why do we care that he altered these embryo drawings to make it look like these various mammals were more closely related embryologically than they really are? Why would we care? It's ancient history. The reason why it's important is that often a person's view on what is true comes from the fact that other people believe it's true. If your parents believe something's true, if the community believes something's true, if your elders believe something is true, you're more likely to believe it's true. Well, our parents, our elders, these teachers, were convinced. Our parents or our grandparents were convinced about evolution based on fraudulent information, based on fraudulent data. They were convinced about the origin of life because a monaran had been discovered. They were convinced about ape-man because an ape-man was discovered. And that was not the only act of fraud that was committed with regard to ape-men. Look up Piltdown Man, or look at the evidence to support Nebraska Man. You'll see it's filled with similar acts of fraudulent activity or terrible distortions of the collected data. This is the kind of data that convinced other people. And again, when a young person grows up in a society where everyone believes something, they're just almost automatically believe it. But beliefs, for a lot of people, were based on fraudulently produced supporting evidence for evolution. Well, let me end with one other example of what should be a homology, a similarity, we should find between vastly different unrelated organisms, and that has to do with chromosome number. Use this maybe as maybe a little quiz to see if you remember anything. Okay, so for example, let me show you some chromosome numbers of various organisms, and we'll see if because if these animals are closely related to a common ancestor, then the chromosome number should be more similar. Tends to reason, right? So we'll just see that if this is the case. Dogs, by the way, those are my dogs. Don't have them any longer, but I always put pictures of my dogs in my PowerPoint. So those, Willie and Eli there, dogs have 78 chromosomes. There's another animal that has 78 chromosomes that must then be very closely related to the dog. Oh wait, that's the chicken. So maybe, I've not tasted dog. Maybe they taste like chicken. Can't really speak to that with any certainty. But let's see. Tomato has 24 chromosomes, so something else that has 24 chromosomes must be very closely related to the tomato too. That's a snail. So I don't know. Haven't tasted escargot either. Maybe that too. Red panda has 36 chromosomes. So again, something else with a similar number of chromosomes should be very related to the. That's the earthworm. So that's not working for us either. Okay, let's try one more. So what has 46 chromosomes? Anyone know what has 46 chromosomes? That's us. But the reason why I have 46 chromosomes, the reason why we have the genes that we have, is not because we have evolved from ape-like ancestors, but because God made us that way. He made us the way we are, made the animals the way they are, as distinct kinds. We're told this clearly in the Bible, Colossians, "For by him all things created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him." Scientists today have ample evidence of creation. Ample evidence of creation. Paul said in Romans 1:20 that for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Abundant evidence of creation all around us. But although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the world we live in. There's abundant evidence for God, abundant evidence that this world has been made. It is so clear. God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen in what has been made. When you look around you and you see the things that are powerful, God has revealed to you his power. When you see the things that are vast in size, beyond comprehension, like the vast scale of the cosmos, we know how big our God is. He's revealed himself to us in that way. When you see something that's beautiful, so beautiful, God has revealed that aspect of himself to us. His eternal power and divine nature clearly seen in what has been made. He is powerful and he is beautiful. And he's the provider, the loving provider. He's made everything we need here. Everything we need has been provided for us. This is the God that we serve. But although they knew God, they could see evidence for God, they did not glorify him as God or give thanks. Instead, they became futile in their speculations. Well, all of this fantastic stuff, these amazingly beautiful and intricately designed things, all that came about all on their own through purely natural processes. That is what they believe. Don't be all, if you're one of those Christians that are kind of on the fence on evolution, there's one last word I want to give you, and that is, remember that the evidence for evolution really comes in two main parts, and that's homology, this design similarities that we have found, and the fossil record. Remember this, that there was a global flood that's described in Genesis 6 or 9, a real historical event, and it is responsible for the fossil record. That fossil record is not a record of the history of life on Earth going back over hundreds of millions of years, as has been interpreted. Using the Bible to interpret that scientific findings is really obvious where those vast layers of sedimentary rocks and all of those fossils of plants and animals came from. They were the ones that died during this act of judgment. And we need to remember that the God that destroyed the world by flood is the same God that we will stand before one day. That God's hatred of sin has not changed. We need to examine our lives and where we are with him and examine your life. Is there sin there? Remember that you'll be standing in the hand of the Almighty God one day who hates sin so much, he destroyed the entire world by flood. But he loves you so much. He's given you everything you need. Watches over you daily and sent his son to die for you, to pay the penalties for our sins, to die for me, to pay the penalty for my sins. That's a loving God. Let me close out in a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you so much, Lord, for everything that you've given us, Father. We're humbled to know that such great love exists, Father. And we just ask today for wisdom, Father. We need wisdom to help us understand the science, all of these teachings that go against the truth that's within your word. Father, we need wisdom to help us understand the science, how to understand the data and to help us interpret that data. Give us wisdom, Lord, to help us understand the science, understand the teachings, and give us boldness, Lord, to speak out when the time is right. Give us opportunities for witness and give us the boldness to speak, to uphold the truth of your creation and the truth of your Son, Jesus Christ, who died for us. Help us to be bold witnesses for you, Lord. Give us that boldness, I ask. We praise you, Lord God. We thank you for everything you've given us, everything you've done. Father God, thank you so much. Father God, walk with us. Guide us, Father, with your rod and with your staff, or guide us to the path of righteousness, we ask. Praise you, Lord God. We thank you again for everything. In Jesus' name we ask all things. Amen.